Okay, sorry. Hi, welcome to our Prisoners' Rights and Abolition workshop. Today we have Lalita Moskowitz, who is a staff attorney at the ACLU of New Mexico, where she began her legal career as an Equal Justice Works Fellow after graduating from the University of New Mexico Law School in 2018. Lalita's main focus is representing incarcerated women whose civil rights have been violated by New Mexico prisons and jails. Lalita currently serves as adjunct professor and director of the UNM chapter of the Marshall Brennan Constitutional Literacy Project, a program designed to teach young people about their constitutional rights and disrupt the school to prison pipeline. She is also a board member for NMCAN, a local organization that supports young people transitioning out of foster care and the juvenile criminal legal system. Before law school, Lalita was a field organizer for Planned Parenthood of New Mexico and served as a team leader for AmeriCorps NCCC. Lalita received her Bachelor of Arts from Connecticut College in 2012. Lalita is passionate about gender equality, empowering young people, fighting for those forgotten behind bars, and dismantling the prison industrial complex. She loves jigsaw puzzles, big hats, and nurturing houseplants. So today she will be talking to us, and then we'll have a Q&A, and then take action brainstorm. Lalita?
Hi, everybody. Funny, I forgot I put that about the plants in my bio, but you all are joining me in my plant room. So although you can't see many of them, we are surrounded by houseplants. I've got a presentation. I'm going to see if I can share my screen. I've never tried to do like it's a Google Doc presentation thing. So we'll just see how, which I have used, but not on Zoom before. So we'll see how it goes. Okay, share. And then, okay. Oh, cool. I can still kind of see. So I can't see the chat, but if anybody has questions as I'm going along, please feel free to just interrupt. I don't think I can see the chat. Oh, I sort of can, but I might not notice. So if you put questions in the chat, I might see them, but I might not. But please feel free to interrupt me, and then I know we'll have a Q&A at the end as well. But please don't hesitate if something's a burning question has come up as we're going along. So just introductions. Oh, let's see, can I make the presentation go? Oh, there it is. So you did kind of an introduction, but yeah, I'm an attorney with the ACLU. This is my favorite GIF of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She says, you know, an inspiration, developed much of the law that supports sort of gender equality in the law today. And her answer, of course, to when will there be enough women on the Supreme Court is when there are 9. Really excited to meet all of you and really impressed by, you know, your sort of commitment to sort of thinking about activism and things that you can do and asking these questions. So thank you for inviting me to talk. I wanted to start just with a sort of a picture of mass incarceration in the US. And I know y'all are pretty world aware, so you may know some of these things, but sort of setting a stage, I suppose, for, you know, the work that I do and why prison abolition is something that I believe in. And, you know, here we're talking about the US incarcerates more of its population than any other country in the world by quite a lot, actually. And this chart from the Prison Policy Initiative kind of shows that. And shows that 1 in 5 prisoners in the entire world is incarcerated in the United States. So we as a country have really committed ourselves to this really awful system of punishment, and we've decided that locking people up is sort of the answer to all of our societal problems. You know, you see all kind of laws, the kinds of things that we criminalize and the kind of reasons that people end up behind bars are varied and mostly not sort of the kind of serious, scary behavior that we would think of as being maybe somebody needs to be removed from society, but we really have this punishment system where we put people in cages as sort of our main solution. And it's not just incarceration. I wanted to show this. I think this is something that folks are sometimes less aware of, which is that there's this larger sort of system of probation and parole that accounts for a huge percentage of sort of people that end up back in the system, and it's sort of this cycle. But you know, I think, I can't remember the statistic I saw, but it's a really significant percentage of folks who aren't incarcerated who are still either on probation or parole, and so they're living with some kind of restrictions in their lives, regular drug tests. They have to, you know, answer every time their parole officer calls. They have to often pay for GPS monitoring or different things like that. And it's a system that really forces people, you know, to stay in a cycle. And there's sort of a whole industry around that as well. So we're talking about prison industrial complex. There are the companies that make the GPS trackers. There are the companies that do the drug testing. There's the, private prison corporations that run prisons and all of these kind of things. And so, when we look at the picture, it's a really big system here. And I put there's this vicious cycle. So technical probation and parole violations, a significant percentage of the individuals who are incarcerated in the US, and here in New Mexico, I believe it's a third of the prison population is in prison for a technical parole or probation violation, which means they were sentenced for whatever crime. They were sentenced to a couple of years, then they were sentenced to, a few years of parole. And on parole, they may have missed an appointment with their parole officer. They may have tested positive for some sort of substance they weren't supposed to be on, in general. They may have, sort of failed to show up for their court-ordered rehab, at some time. But these are all folks who have not committed any new crime. They've simply had some sort of technical violation on their parole and ended up back in the prison system. So that's, like I said, in New Mexico, I think it's a third. I think that's pretty standard across the country, that you have such a huge percentage of folks who are in prison, not even for criminal act, but simply for other things. And parole terms make it really difficult. One of the issues that I've been looking at here in New Mexico is the standard parole term, or condition rather, that requires folks who get out of prison to not associate or spend any time with other people who are either in the system or who have just come out of that system. That can be really difficult because communities that are over policed, communities of color, poor communities where heavy policing and heavy criminalization happen. A lot of times there are families. So a lot of times it's your brother or your sibling or somebody else in your family who's also perhaps on parole, and it makes it really difficult for people. And so people often go back to prison because they're spending time with somebody else who's recently been released. I also find that condition kind of cruel because, especially for folks who've been incarcerated for a long time, really the only other people who understand what you're going through as you transition back into the world and as you're trying to sort out finding a job and housing, the people who are going to understand what you're going through are other people who are going through it as well. And so to force that separation, I find just particularly psychologically cruel. But there's all kind of technical violations that bring people back in the system. And it's an important component of mass incarceration that I think doesn't get a lot of play in sort of conversations in the public sphere, where we think everybody is in prison who has committed some sort of crime, and that's setting aside sort of wrongful convictions and folks who plead guilty to things they didn't do. That's true at the start, but then many folks have not actually committed a new crime but are back for one of these technical violations. So that's a significant issue for sure. The question, and I go through kind of the prison statistics kind of quickly. I think folks are, aware that we incarcerate a lot of people, and it's a serious issue. And of course, we incarcerate many, many more people of color and many more poor people, disproportionate to the population. I think I have a slide in a minute that shows that. But moving to the question of why do we do that? Capitalism is one component of the puzzle. This chart might be a little hard to read. There's a great report that the Prison Policy Initiative did called Follow the Money of Mass Incarceration that shows that this is this billion-dollar industry of locking people up, and everything that goes along with that. And you can see here kind of all the money that is involved. And it isn't just, there's been a lot of conversation about private prisons, and private prisons are awful. No corporation should be profiting off of humans suffering behind bars. But private prisons are by far the only place where money is being generated in the prison industrial complex. So we look at here, you can see private corrections down here is actually one of the smaller bubbles. We have costs to families who have to pay money to speak with their family members on the phone. You have commissary, where incarcerated folks are being sold like basic necessities like shampoo at a serious markup. So those companies are making significant profit there. You have all of the kind of things I was talking about, like the GPS tracking and the drug testing and things that folks are required to pay for when they're released. And so there's a big component, and even here, policing is counted in part of this, and we spend so much money on policing. And so there's money incentive to continue this system running, and to keep things going status quo as it was, which is gross. And then, of course, white supremacy is a huge driver of mass incarceration. And you can see here, this is from the Pew Research Center, that we incarcerate Black Americans much higher. And so you can see, right, that Black folks were 12% of the population in 2017 when this was done, but made up 33% of the prison population. And you can see white people who were 64% of the US population made up only 30% of the prison population. And here too, folks who identify with Hispanic origin are also overrepresented in the prisons. And the way that happens, it's not that people of color commit more crimes, it's that people of color are over-policed, and we have much more policing in those communities. And you have laws that sort of, are racist by design, and then you have enforcement that's really racist in implementation. And so folks are much more likely to get arrested and incarcerated, which is a major problem, and really dates back to slavery and to Jim Crow laws and to all of those things. The racist nature of mass incarceration it's always been true in the United States. And when enslaved people were emancipated, and then when segregation was sort of being chipped away at. I mean, there's still so much segregation, but when it was being chipped away at, white lawmakers turned around and said, how else can we continue to sort of have our white supremacist society? And many of our criminal laws stem directly from that time. Plus, the 13th Amendment, which is the one that did away with slavery, has sort of a significant loophole in it. And just reading the language, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, where the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. So we see right where we've said, okay, we're getting rid of slavery, except that we're going to allow forced labor for those who've been convicted of crimes. And then we continue to pass laws that made more and more things a crime, and that sort of over enforcement in Black communities, which I think was an unacceptable loophole to put in an amendment that was supposed to abolish slavery. So moving on to sort of prisoners' rights work, this is what I do. I sue prisons basically most of the time, and sue to vindicate constitutional rights of incarcerated folks. So individuals who are incarcerated still do have some constitutional rights, such as freedom of speech and freedom of religion and equal protection. Those things do apply in prisons. However, the courts have interpreted those rights to be much more limited in the prison context. So the courts have said, people in prison, you can have freedom of speech, but there's all these reasons why we think it can be limited. This is especially true when we're talking about rights under, like the Fourth Amendment right to privacy, which really goes away almost entirely in a prison. But some of the rights that have been protected stronger than others There's also a statute called the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, that especially protects religion and freedom of religion for incarcerated folks at sort of a stronger, it offers stronger protections than the courts have interpreted the First Amendment to apply in prisons. Have a whole other sort of side conversation that could be had about the way we prioritize religion over every other right in the country, in sort of interesting ways. But certainly it's a good thing that incarcerated folks have those rights. But they have, like I said, been limited by the courts. And of course, the one that I use the most in sort of my work and in my lawsuits is the Eighth Amendment, which says that excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. And cruel and unusual punishment, the definition of sort of what that looks like and what that means has evolved over time. Early cases that interpreted that said, really put a lot of emphasis on unusual. And so they said, here's these cruel punishments, but they were perfectly normal and usual and used all the time at the time that the Constitution was created. And so therefore they're acceptable because it has this cruel and unusual component. The courts have, that has continued to evolve, and actually a great Supreme Court case that says that the Eighth Amendment should be interpreted according to evolving standards of decency, which means that as society hopefully continues to see things as less acceptable, the Eighth Amendment should protect against those things. And so the kinds of treatment that incarcerated folks had to endure at the beginning of our nation should not be, allowable today. That said, it is my view, and especially after 3 years of representing incarcerated people, that prison itself is torture, and it just is cruel by its nature. But the Eighth Amendment, we use it. It comes up in different contexts. It applies certainly to things like excessive force or violence by guards, but it has also been interpreted to require prisons to provide adequate health care to folks who are incarcerated, which is something that I deal with a lot, and other kind of things like that. And so that's the law that we usually turn to when we're trying to sort of protect folks behind bars. I also occasionally use the First Amendment when talking about sort of retaliation and stuff. Oh, here, I have a slide about my work. So I sue prisons a lot. It's fun. I piss off prison officials on a pretty regular basis. And I sue, mostly been representing incarcerated women, and now sort of expanding too, especially during COVID. I spent a huge amount of time and effort trying to force our government to protect incarcerated people during the pandemic, with honestly very limited success. One of the biggest challenges of my work is just that people don't really care. People, you did the time, you did the crimes. I can't even say it because I hate the phrase so much, but people say, you did the crime, you do the time, that's just how it is. And it's really hard to get folks to care. And here in New Mexico, and I think this is true, it's certainly true across the country, although actually our state is actually really behind in terms of criminal systems reform, that it's politically unpopular to do anything that would reduce incarceration or that would even sort of give this impression of being soft on crime. And so our governor was really not interested in protecting incarcerated people during this pandemic in any way that might have been not politically expedient. But we fought a lot to get folks things like masks and hygiene supplies, and we sued to try to get some people released to reduce the population so that people within the prisons could do more things like social distancing and things like that, which is simply impossible in prison. So I spent a lot of time doing that this past year, but I also sue on behalf of folks who have not been receiving adequate medical care. This comes up, we've got a prison up in a really rural part of the state in Springer, New Mexico, where any kind of medical care is about an hour away. It's a women's prison. and the nearest, OBGYN or anybody who could sort of deal with women's healthcare needs is about an hour drive. And the prison is very reluctant to transport folks. And so, I've had a number of women who have been dealing with, serious reproductive health issues who have not been treated because there's not enough staff to transport them, and it takes them an hour to get wherever. So this is something that I sue a lot about. I've also had a number of cases where incarcerated women were sexually assaulted by guards while they were incarcerated. And so we've had some lawsuits about that. And a lot comes up is retaliation. So if incarcerated folks complain about something that's happening, file a grievance through the system saying, I have not been treated, or this person has assaulted me, or whatever it may be, and then get punished and retaliated against for speaking out. It's one of really the most pervasive issues that I see in the prisons that really impacts everything else. Because people are afraid to speak out about any kind of abuses or things that are going on for fear of retaliation. And so that has, what's sort of known in the law as a chilling effect. It means people are less likely to speak out, and that information is less likely to get out. This year, during our legislative session, we advocated for a law that would create independent oversight of our prisons. So right now, the prisons are really insular, and they're self-governed, and they're self-policed, and folks in the outside world don't know a lot about what goes on in prisons. It's really difficult to get information about what's going on behind bars. And so an independent oversight could be really significantly helpful in terms of some of our prison conditions. Unfortunately, the bill did not pass. But so these are the kind of things I do. I also spend lately a lot of time talking to the media about what's going on in prisons, because one of the things that's really important is to get the public to understand, what's going on behind bars, what our state is spending all of this money on, what the state is doing or not doing for human beings, who we've decided to lock up. All of these, sorry, I was temporarily distracted by some birds that are right outside my window. So I spend a lot of time, talking to the media, which isn't necessarily a thing that lawyers always do, but when we're trying to build public awareness around something, that becomes important as well. Yeah, it's a bit of an uphill battle. And by a bit, I say that I sometimes feel like I'm banging my head against a brick wall. But because the way the law has developed, the same way that constitutional rights, the courts have said, yeah, you have these constitutional rights, but they're going to be much more limited in this prison context. Congress has also enacted statutes. In particular, there's a law called the Prison Litigation Reform Act that was passed under Clinton, that really limits incarcerated folks. So there's a limit on how many lawsuits a particular prison can file. You have to exhaust this prison grievance systems before you can even come to court, which is a real barrier to people coming to court, because the prisons will conveniently lose the grievances, or we didn't make a copy of that, or we're going to transfer you to a different prison halfway through the process so that you have to start it over. And so that law, it also limits the money that you can get for certain things. Because what happened was, especially in the 80s, mass incarceration took a real sort of upward turn, and we started incarcerating more and more people as a result of the so-called war on drugs. It really drove mass incarceration. And so, conditions in the prisons were awful, and then lots of people started filing what's called pro se lawsuits, which just means that they didn't have lawyers, but folks were filing lawsuits. And the courts were getting, a little bit overwhelmed with these lawsuits. And so instead of saying, let's change prison conditions or incarcerate fewer people, Congress just decided let's make it harder for incarcerated folks to come to court. And so those are some of the things that we have to deal with. A lot of the sort of goal behind my work, is to sue on behalf of individuals and get money or changes or whatever it may be for individuals, but it's also just to make sure that the prisons know someone is watching. Prisons get away with a lot of stuff because nobody really knows, and the families of incarcerated folks aren't really listened to, and especially prisons that are sort of in these rural parts of the state where they're sort of out of sight, out of mind for many people. And so part of the goal of my work is to keep reminding the prisons, hey, watching you, we're watching you. You can't get away with stuff because I'm watching you. And so even when we lose, that's sort of a component of the work for sure. Additionally, I think the most rewarding part of my job is just being an advocate for folks, many of whom who really have not ever had anybody advocate for them in this kind of way, and listening to people. Prison is incredibly dehumanizing, and so sometimes it makes a really big difference in someone's life to listen and care and believe them when they tell me things that have happened to them. And so I really I hold on to those pieces a lot, because it can feel really discouraging when you're fighting such a system that's as big as sort of the prison industrial complex is. Moving on I wanted to talk to you all a little bit about the school to prison pipeline, which is a component of all of this. And as young people, I think is important stuff to sort of, keep in mind. And you all may be already kind of aware of some of these concepts, but school to prison pipeline is the name that's been given to sort of a series of policies and actions and trends that create this pipeline where young people get pushed out of schools into sort of this criminal system. And it starts with things like zero tolerance policies and having school resource officers, aka having cops in schools, and having also school discipline outsourced to sort of the criminal system. So in many places, instead of, you're having a disciplinary issue, and instead of dealing with it in the school, you call the cop who's in the school, and somebody gets arrested instead of just getting maybe suspended from school, which actually, overuse of suspensions is also part of the school to prison pipeline. Young people get sort of pushed out of the school setting. It becomes a place where some young people feel that they're not safe and they don't belong, and they keep getting punished, and you're out on suspension and your parents are working, and you may end up getting into some trouble because the school has decided to sort of make you somebody else's problem. And we see a lot more, young people are getting criminalized for tardiness, young people getting criminalized for, sort of basic young people rowdy behavior, what have you, things that should never be, criminal in nature. And, even when the discipline is in school, creating this environment in schools that is more punitive than it is a safe learning place, leads again sort of to this path, and young people getting sort of pushed out and pushed into the juvenile system. And folks who are young people who are prosecuted as juveniles, who spend any time in sort of juvenile detention facilities, are significantly more likely to end up in the adult criminal system. And so really starting that process with young people pushes them into that adult criminal system, into those cycles that make it really difficult to get out. And of course, these are things that much more often impact students of color, poor students, and students with disabilities. Instead of sort of having teachers and specialists who are trained in classroom management and trained to support students with disabilities, we see disability behaviors being criminalized. You may have seen news stories about young students with disabilities being handcuffed by the school police officer, things like that. We see overwhelmingly that young people with disabilities are being criminalized in these systems, and young people of color. And of course, that holds true through to the adult system. Significant percentage of incarcerated folks as adults have disabilities, are struggling with addiction, have mental health issues, these kind of things that bring people into the criminal system. And so it's really critical to dismantle these components of the school to prison pipeline, and not have people just funneling into that system as youth. Oh, I have a cops in schools, Jeff. And one of the things I'm going to talk about in terms of potential action brainstorming, and I'll be interested to hear from you all if you do have cops in your schools. One of the sort of movements has been to get police out of schools. And of course, students have rights. All the kind of rights that we talked about before, you know, the Bill of Rights, free speech, equal protection, freedom of religion. But the courts have said that actually, in a really similar way to the prison cases, that young people's rights in schools are diminished. And the logic that is used in these court cases, and when I was in law school, I was taking prisoners' rights course at the same time that I was taking the course about the constitutional rights of young people. And the cases from the Supreme Court use like really similar language and even compare sometimes in saying the reasons that rights have to be limited in prisons is because you need to have control over the situation, and you need to have order, and you need to have all of these things. And they use the same logic for schools. They're saying, well, these rights have to be limited because the schools have to be able to control what goes on and control behavior and avoid, you know, the promotion of drugs and all of these things. And, you know, certainly schools need to be able to create a safe place for young people to learn. But schools are sort of teaching students in some ways by example to accept violations of their rights. And you think about school searches, searches of lockers or school property. You know, young people in schools do have Fourth Amendment rights, but the courts have said the Fourth Amendment rights that students do have are somewhat diminished from what they would be out in the adult real world. And so that is also sort of a contributor to this pipeline. And it really freaked me out when I was reading the cases to see these like really parallel thought processes going on with schools and with prisons. But let me not be just a complete downer in every way and say, you know, there are great movements going on to get police out of schools. There's great criminal system reform. By the way, I don't use the word criminal justice system because there's really no justice in it. And so I use criminal system instead, the criminal legal system. But, you know, there's great criminal legal system reform efforts, and especially, you know, in the wake of the awful violence, you know, that we have seen publicly against Black men and women at the hands of police, and George Floyd in particular, you know, the protests that happened last summer after his, you know, awful murder was seen, you know, around the world. Some good movements have happened around getting police out of schools, around changing sort of policing and things like that. And so, yeah, getting police out of schools is one of those great steps that we're starting to see, you know, efforts around as well. So sort of the last piece of this I want to talk about real quick, and then we can all kind of have question and answer, is the abolition of prisons and the movement to defund police, which has gained, you know, public awareness in the last year or two. It's a movement, you know, led by people of color, and has been happening, you know, has been a vision and has been happening for a long time, but it has really, I think, entered the greater public consciousness kind of recently. And some of the tenets of this is that, you know, because the pushback that these ideas get is, oh, we should just sort of do reform and we can keep doing reform, and why do we have to talk about abolishing and defunding? And the reasons are that we hear a lot, oh, the criminal system is broken. And really the systems aren't broken. They're working the way they were designed to work. And so systems that are designed to be these awful, racist, punitive systems can't simply just be fixed. They really have to be dismantled, and we have to come up with something different. And resources have to be reallocated away from this system. And I will tell you, when I first started my job 3 years ago, I was generally sort of on board for the concept of prison abolition, but I had a lot of questions, and I was like, I mean, I don't know. It doesn't seem like realistic. Like maybe there's other stuff. Representing incarcerated people has made me absolutely a prison abolitionist, and I see how entrenched the systems are and how much they cannot simply just be there's there's no way to sort of just what if we just fix up this current system. And I really see that very deeply. But I wanted to play this short video for you all. I think it's a great sort of explainer of why we're talking about defunding and abolishing. So I'm going to, hopefully this plays. Let me know if you can't hear it.
People have a lot of opinions about policing, and our ideas about policing are shaped by our race, our genders, our class, and our parents. For example, most white people have very little interaction with police. In a recent study, 77% of white people had no contact with police in the previous year. Of those who did, at least half were traffic stops. And in many cases, white people initiated contact by calling the police. Since they have little unwanted contact, many white people's opinions about policing are not based on personal experience. Dominant culture, especially mass media, sells us the image of officer friendly, but whose experience is that actually based on? The same study found that Black people experience excessive force at the hands of police at more than twice the rate of white people. Did we have a just and equitable police force and something went wrong? No. Policing in the South emerged from the slave patrols in the 17 and 1800s that caught and returned runaway enslaved people. In the West, police departments were formed to keep Native people out of cities built by white settlers. And in the North, the first municipal police departments in the mid-1800s helped quash labor strikes and riots against the rich, and policed public spaces to conform to middle-class white morality around gender and sexuality and exclude poor, unhoused, or disabled people. Policing in the US began as a system of economic, social, racial, patriarchal, and ableist control. And that is what it still is today. The truth is police don't do what most people think they do. Police spend more than half of their time responding to non-criminal calls and traffic issues, and only 1 to 3% of their time responding to violent crime calls. Police don't stop violence. They respond to violence that has already occurred, and they respond with their own threat of violence. And that response is not equitable. When people of color are involved, police often engage violently. Yet we spent an astronomical amount of money on the police, over $100 billion a year. Let that sink in. The demand to defund the police is about minimizing the role and power of police in our society. It's about demanding that the government stop writing blank checks for racist control, containment, and punishment. Defunding the police is also about recognizing that police do not solve or address any social issues. They do not prevent harm. What if we took that $100 billion and invested it in our community? What if we had housing, access to healthy food and clean water, healthcare, healing, cooperative businesses, education, childcare, parks, art, and community services? If you already have those things, great. But that's not the reality everywhere. Ask yourself, if we have the resources, why doesn't everyone have this?
So I wanted to show that video because I think it's a great sort of illustration of what we're talking about when we say, you know, these systems were designed this way and the history of policing and what police really do. There was a New York Times article that came out, I think it was in the New York Times recently, that showed police solve, I think, about 2% of crimes, they said, and certainly are not really preventing crimes. They show up after the fact. And we know that what actually prevents crimes is giving people the resources they need to get out of poverty, to uh, help people, you know, with mental health issues and who are struggling with addiction, which is really linked to sort of mental health struggles and poverty and things like that. So we know that money could be, and giving people housing, right? Making sure people are fed. If we transition the money that we spend on these systems into actually giving people what they need to thrive, you know, people don't by and large engage in, you know, sort of what we think of as criminal behavior just for the hell of it. They do it because of the way that our society has sort of forced them into certain patterns. And so the idea is to, right, reallocate resources to giving people the support and the things that they need, so that these systems really become unnecessary. Um, and I meant to sort of say in the beginning, I'm certainly not an expert on prison abolition. I have some resources that I have compiled that I can send to Rebecca if folks are interested in learning a little bit more about sort of the movement from abolition advocates who, you know, are really experts in sort of what this all looks like. But I am certainly on board for the concept. And so I will turn it to questions, and I will stop sharing my screen so that I can see it all again. Stop sharing.
Thank you for that amazing presentation. I really like that video too. Zoe, if you want to take control of the questions, that would be awesome.
For sure. Yeah, reiterating Rebecca, thank you so much, Lalita. I think that was like a really informed, and I can tell that like you're really passionate about these issues that are impacting young folks. And just, yeah. The first question I wanted to ask is, have you ever visited a prison? And if so, how was that experience?
I have. I visit clients in prison, generally speaking. You know, it's the first few to actually, it's been a while since I've gotten to go visit a client in prison because of COVID. I was just trying to remember, I think pretty much every time I drive home from a prison, I cry in my car on the way home because they're absolutely awful places. I mean, they put prisons right in places where nobody wants to see them, so they want it to be out of, so they're in these sort of far out places. The women's prisons in New Mexico, I visited both, are in just, you know, cold, isolated places. You've got the razor wire all around, and the sounds of prison, you know, the clanging of doors and sort of walkie-talkies and you know, everybody in there sort of orange, and there's no like greenery or you know, this sort of really dismal environment, and just, you know, the way that prison staff talk to people, the way that sort of you know, every movement is controlled. You know, it's the first couple of months I was doing my job, I had a lot of nightmares about being in prison. They were very informed nightmares. And I woke up and I was like, okay, I can't keep happening. But it really dehumanizes, and to sort of, you know, the point about prison staff, something that I've come to kind of understand, because, you know, I've had clients who say, oh yeah, so-and-so used to be like decent person, and then the prison beat it out of them, where staff members come in and they think they're gonna help, and they're gonna maybe change somebody's life and support, you know, sort of corrections, as we call it, and rehabilitation, and the system just over the years turns people cruel because the system itself is so cruel. And so you really see that when you visit, and it's cold and it's miserable. And I actually just so this week there was our legislature had an interim committee hearing, and the corrections department gave an update, and they're considering closing one of the prisons that I was talking about in this really rural part of the state, which I was thrilled to hear that they were closing. And now they're backtracking because the town that the prison is in, like the whole economy of the town is based on the prison. So everybody in that town is like working for the prison in some kind of way. And it was awful to listen to people talk about prisons as like job creators, and like it's economically important to keep this prison running. Is really awful. But I mention it because, I certainly started with sort of a dichotomy in my head of like, okay, the guards are all evil, and like the system is evil. But you have people coming from the same communities. So you have like low income people who the only job they can get is as a guard in the prison, and it's an awful job that wears people down. And so it really is an awful system on both sides. And like, look, I have no qualms about suing a guard who's abused somebody. There's no excuse, but that environment is awful for everybody who's involved. And it's something that I've really come to think a lot about lately. But yes, it's really important to me to visit the prisons, because it's really important to me to like really understand the environment that my clients are going in. But it's really awful. I always feel miserable after I leave.
For sure. Thank you for sharing your experience. I feel like just like that dependence on like finance or like economic dependence on prisons, and sort of like the idea that everything is coming from the evil system. And so on that, I guess I was wondering, like, with this dependence on like punitive justice within like the incarceration system, I was wondering about sort of like there was like economic reliance. I was thinking about like on reliance of like what it means to be safe. And so like I guess this is maybe more of like a psychological thing, but that also has to do with like other systems. But on ideas of safety, why are we reliant on prisons and police? And like how do we sort of and like how can we like is it possible to validate those fears while also working towards abolition? And I specifically was asking this more on the broad spectrum, but also I was having a conversation with my dad about like abolishing the police, and he asked like what he should do if someone like breaks into our house, or like who is he supposed to call, what is he supposed to do. And maybe this has to do with like the larger idea of like how do we talk to our parents about this, and like how do we sort of educate people about abolition, while also like validating their fears, and whatnot.
Yeah, that's a great question, really thoughtful question. And yes, the best way to do advocacy is you have to start from sort of a shared place. And so you have to be able to say, yeah, we all want to feel safe. Like that nobody is saying that that's not a valid concern. But what we're saying is that actually the police don't make most of us safer. The police make middle and upper class white people feel safer most of the time. And some others, it's not a black and white line, but that in general, they don't actually make communities safer. I saw something that was really compelling about this, that was talking about suburbs. And it was like, when we think about abolishing the police, look at suburbs in like, like middle class-ish suburb out of anywhere. You don't see cops around anyway. Where do you every once in a while, maybe you see the cop drive by, but the community is sort of, taking care of itself in some ways. You have your park, you have your neighbors looking out for each other, you have other structures, you have people who have the resources they need. So you aren't having those folks, breaking into each other's homes because they got what they don't, why would they? They don't need to. And so thinking about, yeah, the defunding the police doesn't mean tomorrow there are no cops and we've got nothing else for it. It's a process that has to be sort of long term. And abolishing the prisons doesn't mean tomorrow we open all the prison doors and we just see what happens, but that we replace those systems with systems that are better. So we take funding from the police and we support mental health crisis intervention. We support how we house people. The with incarceration, we're already paying to house people. We're just doing it much more expensively than we could be if we just actually housed people, in the community. And so things like that, where there might still be right now a time where there's nothing for it but to call the police. There's no other resource. But the idea is that we create other resources that don't require sort of policing, and they don't require guns, right? As you know, we have other interventions. There are some great, I will send you, there's a great sort of like frequently asked questions article that I found that has a lot of the things like this that sort of like help to respond to some of these like very honestly really valid, important questions that people ask about this. That I will send you all, because I think there's some really, really great resources for how to have these conversations. But yeah, I really like the sort of premise of your question, which is that we have to validate people's fears and start from a place of what does safety mean.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I would love those resources as well, and I think starting conversations is really important.
Yeah, I will absolutely send that. I have them all, bunch of tabs open on my computer. I have some stuff open on my computer in my office, so I'll send you the things I actually have here, and then I might follow up and send you another email with some more things, because I went down a great rabbit hole yesterday, sort of looking at different resources about this.
Yeah, shout out rabbit holes. I was also wondering, if you're pulling up those resources, I guess I'm like looking at the questions. What are some good things to ask? And maybe we can get more of these questions in when we get to the take action portion as well. But I was wondering, so we had a workshop back in January with this woman named Cecile Lipworth, and I think we were talking about, like, we mentioned like Harvey Weinstein and sort of like thinking about like the Me Too movement, and sort of like we need to put these people in prison in order to feel safe because they committed a lot of heinous acts against people, and there was like a lot of harm done, but also thinking about carceral feminism, and that's like a term that I've just like recently learned. But this is the question that I asked Cecile. We talked a little bit about restorative and transformative justice. How do you build accountable communities when someone has harmed another person? With violence against women and men like Harvey Weinstein, who have harmed many women, how do we grapple with transformative justice when we address harm by using the criminal justice system, which focuses a lot on punitive forms of justice? So thinking about like transformative justice and carceral feminism, and like how do we sort of keep each other safe while also not falling into these. I know it's a complex, and I'm starting to grapple with it too. I was wondering if you have any.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just clicked into open this frequently asked questions thing that I had, because I will say this is one of the things I struggle the most with, is gender-based violence and sexual abuse, is where I really, because I mean, even the criminal system is terrible about this too, right? We don't believe survivors and all of these things. But I also like, that's where like the Harvey Weinsteins, I'm like, yeah, throw that guy and lock away the key, like, right, or throw away the key. I still I struggle here too, and it's really where like my values like are put to the test. And I think there's a number of answers. There may be folks, there are those limited circumstances where people actually do need to be removed from sort of general society. But what that looks like doesn't have to look anything like prisons as we know them today. And so I think that's, one of the answers, is that there may be some folks, but what that looks like is maybe, not prison. Maybe it's somebody has to, remain, monitored under a certain situation in a home. Maybe Harvey Weinstein has to downgrade and not live in whatever rich person home he lives in. But that there are, alternatives, but that are not focused on retribution. But that whatever those systems are for those limited, right, when we take away the impacts of poverty, and mental health harms that are not being properly addressed and things like that, like the need for incarceration, those small number of people who are going to cause those awful harms anyway, those people, there is a lot of conversation about, like, how do we repair the harm that has been done, repair the relationships that have been harmed. When we think about gender-based violence, it's mostly, right, folks that somebody knows, and what are those real, like, actual rehabilitation that isn't just focused on retribution. So it's not that we just say, well, he messed up and, whatever, but that, right, sometimes, people may have to be removed from general society, but it doesn't need to look anything like prison. And that it's focused on, right, actual change, actual rehabilitation. I think we all know, right, like, there's stories about sort of like the sociopath serial killer who might actually genuinely be dangerous to society and maybe forever. But what methods we choose to sort of keep that person from society can look really different. And I was just looking at this article because it comes up all the time. And I'll send you this. I'll put it in the chat right now too, and I'll send it to you as well because it's got some great answers. But the other thing to sort of note about that is that the prison system is actually full of sexual abuse. So first of all, addressing the harm by sort of perpetuating more of that harm is of course never helpful. And that folks who get released from prison, prison is a trauma that does not cause it. So somebody who gets incarcerated for domestic abuse comes back into the world more likely to continue that pattern than actually even, probably when they went in. And so when we're using that to address the harm, we're actually kind of perpetuating and making a lot of the violence worse. And so that's also something to bring up. But it's a really, I struggle still, I'm really trying to educate myself on the answers to this question precisely because it's the place that I really struggle the most.
Oh yeah, thank you so much for answering that question. I'm also trying to like grapple with that question as well. I feel like there's different forms of harm, and like these different forms of harm are like put into I don't know, just like a cycle of harm, which you were talking about, which makes it more complex, but requires our attention. Rebecca, do we have time for one more question, or should we get into the other part?
If you have another question, go for it. I would also say that I agree. Like, that's a really hard balance to strike.
Sure. Yeah, I guess my last question, and I know we have like more, but maybe we can talk about that later in the take action portion. But I was thinking about like, how do we get from today to tomorrow? If you're like comfortable sharing, what are your personal experiences of liberation, healing, resistance, resilience, and just like being whole?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yeah. It's on sort of a very personal level, from what you're, just transitioning sort of from that last question too, I, as a young person, was victim of domestic abuse. And I think back to sort of, it would have been, good for me to probably be removed from that system. Would it have been good for my dad to be incarcerated? Like, would that have helped me in my life? I do not think that it would. But thinking through, healing and liberation, and what does it mean to sort of, I feel like rehumanize. We've chosen this sort of system of punishment and really like extreme dehumanization. And what does it mean to sort of like give humanity back to like everyone involved? the person who causes the harm, the person who's experienced the harm. I don't know a lot about it at all. I don't want to speak from a place of sort of misinformation, but I have read some pieces of writing from Native American judges and some of the tribes in New Mexico whose systems of justice always involved a much more restorative pattern that involved accountability in a human way, and sort of offering humanity back to somebody who's caused harm, and finding the root of why it is that that person caused that harm, in a way that involves the victim of that, and sort of creating wholeness there. But sometimes, I come back to this sort of returning people's humanity. When I think about some of my clients, a woman who was sexually assaulted by a prison guard, really awful. She was raped by the guard, and actually ended up getting pregnant in prison, and having a miscarriage while she was in prison. It was just an incredibly awful situation. And through all that, you have all this victim blaming that goes on, and this system that just never treated her as a human being, and people who never listened to how she felt, and what all this meant. And sometimes there's healing that comes, we sued, and we're going to get her some money that means she might get to have like more stability in her life now that she's been released. And that's something, but the money isn't really it. The lawsuit is about being heard. And it's whether or not a court hears or agrees. Part of what I have seen has been sort of healing for her is being heard in her deposition, being heard by her lawyers. I have sat with her for a long time and just listened to her talk about that experience, and like what that meant, and validating that it wasn't her fault, and that she's a human being who deserves something so far beyond what she received in the prison and ever. And sometimes, like, I think too, victims, we've done a lot of work at the ACLU with victims of crime who believe that the system should be different. And a lot of times too, I think people who have been victimized want to feel heard, and this is the system that they have. So they're like, you hurt me and I want you to go to prison. And if we had a system that was like an acknowledgement of the harm, and a sort of like giving you back a feeling of safety that you've been taken from you, or given back a feeling of humanity that's been taken from you. And I don't know what exactly that looks like. But I've seen that, like, it isn't the punitive, this guard was criminally prosecuted. He got a suspended sentence, which really pissed my client off, because she's like, yeah, if I mess up, I'm in prison 5 seconds later. And he's like out there living his life. But really, like, criminal prosecution wasn't what healed her or made her feel whole. What has helped her to start the process of feeling whole is being heard and having her humanity validated. And I think that goes kind of on both sides. A lot of times folks, right, there's the dumb phrase, hurt people, but it's true most of the time. And so I think about resilience coming from sort of like addressing some of that underlying hurt and humanity. And anyway, that's a bit of a rambling answer to the question, but that's something that I think about a lot.
That was beautiful. Thank you for answering that question. I want to give everybody just like, maybe let's just like take a collective breather after that. Okay. But yeah, thank you, Lalita. I think I'm gonna hand the mic over to Rebecca now for our action portion. But yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I see in the chat, my mom has asked if you have any resources or ideas for use in elementary school classrooms that move away from punitive punishments, because she's starting a job in 4th grade.
Oh, exciting. Yes, not off the top of my head, but with my work with the Marshall Brennan program, I've got a bunch of things kind of compiled, and I can send some resources on that for sure.
Awesome. Okay, so thank you for that amazing Q&A. We can start our take action portion. We actually have an article a little bit about prison abolition, and there's some take action ideas in there, like writing state representatives to bring criminal justice reforms to their attention, providing friends and family with phone numbers of mental health services so they can call someone in a crisis, not to be a bystander. If you see racism from cops or intervening, holding your city accountable, creating signs and petitions to, create and sign petitions to promote justice reform, and supporting organizations such as the Marshall Project, and educating yourselves. Does anyone have, sorry. Like, I know in my school district, Zoe's school district too, our school district has gotten rid of SROs. Like, how would someone whose school district hasn't taken that step, how could they start that process or kickstart that process in their community? Like, do you have any ideas, Lalita, or could we brainstorm or something?
Yeah. And I don't know, are you all in the same school district that's gotten rid of the SROs?
Zoe and I are, and Sophia is, and my mom is going to be teaching in San Leandro, so I'm not sure if that school district has or not. Not sure.
Yeah, I mean.
Oh, sorry. And what about the other people, the other young people in the group who are going to see this recording? Are they in the same school district as you all?
Yes.
Or different?
Okay. They are all in our district.
Same, yeah. It's a great question. I mean, I think always, going to school board, sometimes school boards have like, public meetings, right? Writing to educators, talking to your teachers about it, right? Like getting, and there are great resources. I have some stuff on this too, the resources. I'll send you just like an email with a bunch of, I got a bunch of stuff I can send you resources, and there's some great resources to help. Cause I think a lot of what's hard about this stuff is like, young people are like, right? Like younger generations are always on board. Like they're always thinking, sort of visionarily, forward. Like it's not hard to get well, I shouldn't say this. I think it's probably easier to get your peers to understand something, because that's how sort of things work. Is like younger people are always ready to like make positive, better changes. And a lot of the challenge, like you kind of raised, is how do we talk to our parents about this stuff? How do we talk to our teachers about this stuff? And so there are some good resources to sort of help. For me, I was like, yeah, I'm down with prison abolition, but with like before I like could understand. And then people would be like, yeah, but how are we going to address this or that? And I was like, I don't know. Like I need to, like, I trust the people who are doing it know what they're, but so like it can be really helpful. And then so I spent a lot of time kind of reading and educating myself and trying to really understand, so that when people ask me that question, I could be like, let me tell you. And so I think in some ways, like really educating ourselves and really arming ourselves with the tools to talk about this stuff is like sometimes like the first step. And then, yeah, talking about it with your parents, talking about showing up at the school board meeting, letter campaign. Students have First Amendment rights as long as they don't materially or substantially disrupt the learning environment. So, demonstrations of different kinds that aren't going to, disrupt learning, whether it's shirts or the Supreme Court case that was the first case that established that public school students have First Amendment rights, was called Tinker, and it was about young people who were wearing black armbands to protest the Vietnam War. And the court said, they were wearing these armbands. It wasn't disrupting anything. They were showing something. So things like that, I think, can be meaningful, especially in this day. Like sometimes visual displays, right? Like, social media, somebody take a picture and they show up somewhere, and like how those things can have real ripple effects.
for sure. So, I said other ideas that we have listed on our website, and I'll add what we've talked about. And does anyone have an idea of how they will take action based on what we've talked about, or what they want to do?
I think just like thinking about humanizing prison or people who are incarcerated, I think is a really good step. I feel like just the carceral system of punishment, like punitive justice, just sort of goes into the other sort of direction of that, and I think we need to like go back to just recognizing people's humanity. Um, and so I it was like last year, I don't know, there's this organization, it's like a kind of a grassroots project. Not, is it a grassroots project? It's in a house called like Radical Compassion. I love that. I'm writing that down. But it's an organization in Berkeley, and it here, did I put in the chat? Yeah, Prisoners Literature Project, and you basically go into a space and they have a bunch of like a sort of like a library of books that you can sort of package, and then people who are incarcerated from like across the country, they send letters, and you read the letters and they talk about what they like, their interests. Maybe they're really into gardening, or they want to learn Spanish or something like that, or they want books about like Native American history or something. And so you kind of like go into this sort of like library of books and you like look for books for them, or maybe you think, oh, maybe they would like this, maybe they would like this science fiction novel, or this one, or this like poetry anthology or something like that. And so, or like a coloring book or something like that. But anyways, there's like so many I don't know. It was just a really cool experience, and you can like package the books, and you can like write letters back to them. But yeah, Prisoners Literature Project, and I think they're opening up. They were closed for like quarantine, but yeah, you can like if you live in the Bay Area. But I'm sure like there's like other projects like this happening. But yeah, it's a really amazing and incredible organization. That really tones down on like humanizing other human beings, which is like seems obvious, but but yeah.
It seems obvious maybe to us on this conversation, but it does not seem obvious to a lot of people. And I think even that's why I say like it sounds simple, but even having conversations with people that like brings humanity back, talking about those things publicly, they start to like come into the consciousness in a way that is like actually meaningful.
Yeah, I really like the idea of sending letters and books to incarcerated folks.
We did a book drive. I did last year before, whenever pre-COVID, did a book drive for incarcerated folks, and we drove like 500 books to a couple of different prisons. That was like a really positive. I have this beautiful thank you letter from one of the library crew in one of the prisons that's hanging up in my office. That's like little things like that. Yeah.
Nice. My mom put in the chat that apparently my Girl Scout troop sent books to prisoners before when we did a book drive. I did not remember that, but that's cool.
That's awesome.
If anyone else has an idea, feel free to share. Otherwise, here is a form that I would really appreciate if everyone filled out. Lalita, you don't need to, but here's a form to just share your feedback on the workshop. And thank you all so much for coming. Thank you so much, Lalita, because that was so helpful in taking how I'm gonna think about it from now on too.
Oh, good. Well, you have my email address. Feel free to share it with anybody if folks have more questions or want to talk to me about anything. I'm more than happy to. So, and I'm going to send you an email maybe later today, but I might just send it on Monday because I got a bunch of stuff on my work computer to send you. But I will send you a bunch of resources and things that we've talked about.
Okay, amazing. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lalita. We appreciate you taking time out of your weekend for us.
Y'all are awesome. And yeah, fight the fight.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.